Hello, and welcome to the Hill for Literacy Speaker Series. My name is Eleni Stedman, and today I am thrilled to introduce you to Dr. Rachel Romeo. She is our speaker today. She is a professor of neuroscience at the University of Maryland. Before I give a more formal introduction to Rachel, I wanted to let the group know a little bit about Hill for Literacy. At Hill for Literacy, we strive to create a world where every child is a reader. Our mission is to advance equitable literacy outcomes for students pre-K through 12. Hill for Literacy is a nonprofit literacy organization founded in 2001, and we provide in-person consultation as well as asynchronous courses for professional development that support evidence-based instruction. For anyone who is registered for today's webinar, we are doing a drawing that will offer one free asynchronous Science of Reading course, and that is 10 modules. So be on the lookout for an email from Hill for Literacy because you just might be a winner. And now I am excited to introduce you to our guest, Rachel Romeo. Rachel is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. She works in the departments of human development and quantitative methodology, hearing sciences, and neuroscience and cognitive science. She is also a licensed speech language pathologist specializing in pediatric language and reading learning differences. Dr. Romeo is interested in how students or children's early literacy experiences, both favorable and adverse, influence their brain and cognitive development with a focus on language and literacy development. At UMD, she directs the Language Experience and Development Lab, or LEAD, which integrates methods from developmental psychology, cognitive neuroscience, and education to investigate how the developing brain adapts to variations in early experiences. This work is translational in nature and aims to influence education, clinical practice, and social policy to reduce inequities in education and child development. Dr. Romeo's research has received international press as she has been honored with early career awards from the American Speech, Language, and Hearing Association, the Society for Research in Child Development, and the Association of Psychology Science, and the Developmental Psychology Neuroscience Society. Her research is currently funded by the National Institutes of Health, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and the Brain and Behavior Institutes. Wow, Rachel, that is quite the bio right there. So interesting and so excited to have you with us today. Folks who are joining us, if you have questions during today's session, please add them to the Q&A. You can post them right there and we will get to them after Rachel's presentation. And now, without further ado, thank you so much for coming to talk to us, Rachel. Let's jump right on in.
Thank you so much for that really sweet introduction. I'm so excited to speak with everyone today. I'll give you a fair warning. It's going to be kind of a data-heavy talk. One of my students the other day called me a certifiable data nerd, and I consider that a badge of honor. So I'll be sharing some of my research, as well as a lot of research from others, really foundational stuff in the field, as well as some new exciting stuff, and with some practical implications. So first, I thought I'd just sort of introduce my lab and my work and the things I'm really interested in. I call us the LEAD Lab, Language Experience and Development. We work on sort of three main themes of research. So the first, we're interested in how early experiences in children's lives shape their neurocognitive development, and we focus on both sort of distal structural factors in society as well as proximal factors in children's day-to-day lives. We also look at what drives risk and resilience to adversity. So we're interested in how certain supportive experiences can buffer the negative experiences of adversity, but also how different children at different times and different contexts may respond differently to the same environmental exposures. And then finally, we translate this work to practice. So, and try and understand how we can optimize learning for heterogeneous brains. So, typically in the United States, we have an educational model that is often really intended for children in relatively advantaged environments. And other children may not benefit as much from these. And so we do two kinds of interventions. Some are proactive, where we try to alter the early environmental factors that convey adversity, and then also adaptive interventions where we also focus on the education itself and try and bring educational models with evidence into supporting all children. And so, with that, I'm excited to talk to you today about oral language and how it supports literacy development with some insights from neuroscience. And so, I thought we'd start with what I mean by oral language. And so, I've got a couple of figures up here on the left. This is a figure that every intro linguistics student sees, and speech pathologists too. Bloom and Leahy and their seminal model divide language into three separate but overlapping components. There's the form of language, the content, and the use. And the overlap represents a successful integration for understanding and transmitting communication. And so form, this blue circle, is what we consider the building blocks of language. This is our phonology, or our sound system, our morphology, or word structures, and then our syntax, or how we combine words into sentences to make larger thoughts. Then we have our green circle, which represents content. And this is the semantics of language, or what it actually means. So this includes vocabulary, knowing what a cat and a dog are, but also understanding the meaning of words when they're combined into phrases and sentences. So knowing that, the dog chased the cat is different than the cat chased the dog, that they have a different meaning. And then finally, we have our sort of peach colored circle representing pragmatics. And this is our use of language in a social context. So I tell my students, you probably wouldn't talk to your roommate the same way you talk to your grandmother. So that's something about the use of language in context. And when we use oral language as a term referring to the foundation of reading, we mean both form and content. Sometimes also use, but especially both form and content. And then on the right is a sort of a complementary figure from Louisa Moat's work, showing how these different skills combine to create a strong oral language base. That oral language comprises all of these factors. And so this is probably a visual that might be familiar with anyone who teaches reading. So on the left, we have what is called the simple view of reading. And it's a model of how reading comprehension develops. And it characterizes skillful reading comprehension as a combination of two separate but equally important components. The first is oral language, or what is listed here is listening comprehension, or our ability to understand speech or language. And then also word recognition skills. So this is our decoding ability to, in this picture, see that the word elephant is written on the page and sound it out. And then the listening comprehension would be knowing that an elephant is this large creature in the world. And so if a student cannot recognize words on the page accurately and automatically, their fluency will be affected, and in turn, their reading comprehension will suffer. Likewise, if a student has poor understanding of the meaning of the words or the meanings of the words in context, their reading comprehension will suffer also. And so these are equally important components of reading. And then on the right is an image of Scarborough's reading rope. And it ultimately just shows how these two skills are sort of intimately intertwined. So language comprehension or oral language on the top, and then decoding or word recognition skills on the bottom. As children learn to read, they become increasingly strategic, increasingly automatic or fluent, and those become intertwined. I also really like this graphic because it shows the component parts of both language comprehension and decoding. Um, and then the final sort of like big figure I'll show you before sort of diving into more. This is an image created by Pamela Hook, who taught when I was in speech pathology school. And I love it. I call it the complex view of reading. It's not really named that, but it's the simple view, but with more. And it shows that we have these code related skills. Those are on top in that big circle up here. So that's our ability to know that letters stand for sounds, and back and forth between the two. And then on the bottom, we have our our oral language components. That's what we're talking about today. So knowing what words mean, knowing how to put them together and how to use them in context. And the reason I showed you this one is because it integrates additional aspects of cognition. So on the left, we have aspects of attention, executive functioning, and memory, which are sort of domain general cognitive skills that are really important for learning to read and being a strong, fluent reader, as well as aspects of sort of lower level skills in our physical abilities, our sensory capacities. And so this acknowledges that there's a myriad of other factors beyond just oral language and code related skills, both internal and external to the child, that can influence reading. And so I introduced all of this because I wanted to share with you about the importance of oral language for reading. And so hang with me through one more graph. So this figure is from an excellent paper I really recommend. It's from the National Institutes of Health, their Early Child Care Research Network. It draws on data from over 1,000 children in the NICHD study of early child care and youth development. And this followed children from ages 3 until they were in 3rd grade. And the goal, there were many goals of this study, but one of the goals was to investigate the role of oral language and reading competence during the transition to school and the early elementary grades. And the reason I really like this is because they take a broad view of what oral language is. Often when we talk about the role of oral language in literacy, it's often conceived of just vocabulary, so just word meaning. But this study specifically showed that there's so much more than vocabulary that is critical for reading. So they are looking at oral language broadly defined. So that includes vocabulary, receptive and expressive vocabulary, but also syntax, so knowing how the words combine into sentences, semantic knowledge of, okay, what does those big sentences mean? And then also aspects of narrative discourse processes. So being able to understand an entire story, being able to tell an entire story, having memory for what happened at the beginning of the story. And so this study ultimately found that when we take this really broad view of oral language, both the form and the content, it plays both a direct role in children's decoding ability or word recognition abilities, as well as an indirect role through decoding skills on children's ultimately reading comprehension. And so through the transition to school, this broad conception of oral language serves as a better foundation for early reading school skills than vocabulary alone. And so I wanted to provide this base of how oral language really supports literacy, both from the early grades when you're still learning to decode, as well as through later grades when you're reading for comprehension. And so now I'll sort of turn us to the brain. I promised you the brain. I'll give this quick primer on brain development relative to language. So what you're seeing here is the left hemisphere of the brain. So if you were to look at the left side of someone's head from their ear inwards, sometimes I also say if you hold up your right hand and you see this sort of fist shape right here, that's my view of the left hemisphere. So you can remember that at home too. And so up here in the front, you have what's called Broca's area. That is our primary speech production area. It's responsible for being able to produce speech, as well as some deeper parts of understanding meaning. And then in the back part, kind of right where your thumb splits from your first finger, that's what we call Wernicke's area. So that's our primary receptive language area. So it's what allows you to understand what I'm saying right now. Interestingly, the Wernicke's area is right next to our primary auditory cortex. So as soon as you hear sounds and your brain recognizes that it's language, it's right next to Wernicke's area. Broca's area, responsible for speech production, is right next to the parts of your motor strip in your brain, so the parts that actually move your mouth and move your lungs and your tongue and all of those things. So you can see how the brain is sort of efficiently organized to support speech and language, speech and language both. In reality, it's not quite this modular. There's more of a network and different regions work together. So I say it's truthfully more complicated than this, but this is sort of our base language model in the brain. And then when we look at regions in the brain that are important for reading, it's essentially our language network plus a visual part of the brain that recognizes letters and text. So we have our Broca's area up here, aspects of deep meaning, as well as word pronunciation. We have our Wernicke's area back here. So that helps us analyze phonological information. And the first place that when you read a word that the brain processes it is in what is called the visual word form area. And this is a region of the brain that recognizes specifically letters and text. It's a part of the brain that develops over the course of literacy development. It's not a part of the brain that is specialized for reading when you're born. It develops this special ability for reading. And so it takes a lot of teaching and time to develop this part of the brain. But ultimately, it's the part of the brain that recognizes text. And then when you read words or sentences or text, when you're first starting a first reader and first learning, words take an indirect route in your brain. So first you recognize the text. This is letters, and that's what we call the orthographic part of the brain. Then you're going to sound it out. Think about what letters make what sounds. And then finally, you can reach the deep meaning of things, of the words and the text you're reading. And we call that the indirect route. As you become a much more skilled reader, you no longer need to sound out words. You can recognize whole word forms and patterns, and that we call the direct route. In this way, the brain recognizes the text and sends it straight up to the semantic region for sort of an automatic, more fluent way of reading. And so this is my crash course on the brain for language and reading. You're all set now. You're good to go. And so these parts of the brain that process language and text, they happen to be most plastic, or that's a term we use to mean most able to form new connections or most able to develop during what are called sensitive periods in the first years of life. So your brain develops absolutely fastest within minutes of being born, and actually before birth as well. The brain is making trillions of connections every second, and so we have what are called sensitive periods for different aspects of cognition. So the first things that our brain develops are our sensory pathways, so our ability to do vision, to see and to hear. And then our brain starts to develop language. And so we have what we call a sensitive period for language during the early months and years of life. And then ultimately, we have sensitive periods for higher cognitive functions as well. So being able to do things like reasoning or logic. And what's really interesting, so this is a figure that shows regions of the brain that show physical cortical growth during different sensitive periods. And so the regions in blue, which are our language regions over here, and then some of the homologs on the right side, those are regions that are showing the most physical cortical growth during the sensitive period for language. So it makes sense. Those are the parts of the brain that are developing the most during that time. So that means physical cortical growth happening during that time. And so during those sensitive periods, for language development, the brain is maximally receptive to learning language from experience. So we learn language by hearing language or seeing language. What's fascinating to me, and I think anyone who's ever tried to learn a second language, especially if you tried to do it later in life, our sensitive periods for language development are early in childhood. And so that's why children are like little sponges for language. They pick it up so easily, usually in the first years of life. And then as they get older, and you get to my age, it becomes much harder to acquire another language. And I think is particularly interesting is that it's especially important those early years, that sensitive period for learning the structural elements of language. So what we talked about, the form, the phonology, the morphology, and syntax. It's easier to learn vocabulary throughout your life. If you've ever tried to learn a second language or a third or fourth language as an adult, was it easier to learn vocabulary words, or how to put them in a sentence and conjugate verbs? Probably easier to learn vocabulary words, right? So there is no sensitive period for vocabulary, but there does seem to be a sensitive period in the brain for these structural elements, these grammatical elements. And so it's really important to build oral language skills early before children start formal school, because that's when their brains are most receptive to building these skills. So my primary area of research, I primarily study socioeconomic disparities in children's language and literacy development. So socioeconomic status, or all abbreviated as SES, is an index of a child's or an individual's access to financial, educational, and social resources, and then all the benefits that come from those that social standing. And low SES is associated with many developmental risk factors. Adverse childhood events, or ACEs, is a term we often use for aspects of early adversity, as well as aspects of chronic stress. So these are environmental factors that confer risk for poor developmental outcomes, including some that affect health, things like maybe nutrition, toxin exposure, as well as other factors more associated with cognitive development, things like access to high quality education. And what's sobering and important to me is that a child's SES is consistently one of the strongest predictors of their academic achievement. So this is a graph of reading scores of fourth grade children in the United States. Those are the dark lines. And then I also threw in where I'm physically located in Maryland, in sort of the lighter colors. And it's split by eligibility for free and reduced price lunch. And this is an indicator of family income. A child is typically eligible for free and reduced price lunch if their family earns less than about 200% of the federal poverty line. And so what I want you to take away from this graph is that these lines, the red and the blue, they're practically parallel. The gap is not closing. Actually, in 2022, the gap was as large as it ever has been. So that's our pandemic effect. It's especially close to home for me because where I am in Maryland is in the top 5 states for the biggest gap, income related achievement gap. So this is clearly a pressing problem, and I'm interested in trying to understand its precursors to ultimately affect change. And so this is a very simplified model of how these disparities in literacy arise and then how they affect children's later outcomes. And so I'm going to work through this backwards. So first, this is what we see at school age and beyond. So we see socioeconomic differences in children's literacy skills, their ability to do decoding, automaticity, and fluent reading, reading comprehension. I know there's so many teachers on this call today, so I'm preaching to the choir when I say, you know how important these literacy skills are for life outcomes. So academic achievement in all grades, once you're reading textbooks to learn, then your literacy can affect all of your academic achievement, interest in learning, and ultimately life outcomes. However, these literacy differences don't just materialize at school age. I'm trying to convince you that, that the importance of early life. And so they start as early as infancy. We see these differences in language development. And so we see socioeconomic differences in both early literacy skills as well. So things like letter knowledge and familiarity with print, as well as our core oral language skills. So things like phonological awareness, or knowing how sounds go together, things like our vocabulary, and even content knowledge about what you're reading about. It's hard to read the word elephant if you don't know what an elephant is. And then moving back another step, we see a precursor in disparities in early enriching experiences. So aspects related to the home language environment, exposure and access to books and print, access to high quality childcare and preschool, and varied experiences outside the home, which are especially important for developing content knowledge. And then finally, these are driven by disparities in the environment. So financial and material resources, caregivers' education or access to education, and access to other resources. And so ultimately, when we see these achievement gaps, they're often preceded by what we call opportunity gaps. And so today I'm going to walk through some of these processes with evidence from cognitive studies and the brain. And I will work backwards. So starting with showing how differences in early language and literacy skills, pre-literacy skills relate to differences in children's literacy. I lied, there's one more heavy graph. So this is a study I particularly like. I know it's a dense figure, but from this study with Durham et al., they were interested in how children's oral language development during preschool may help explain the relationship between SES and then children's academic achievement, so reading and math skills in the later elementary grades. And they use some very sophisticated statistical modeling skills. I'm not going to go through that specifically, but I put the takeaway kind of here at the top. They ultimately find that children's oral language skills in preschool, right before kindergarten, and again, this is broadly defined oral language skills, so not just vocabulary, but vocabulary and structure, morphology and syntax, as well as an aspect of verbal memory. They found that this broad conception of oral language explains nearly all of the effect of SES on children's elementary school performance. And this is in both reading and math skills. So that's that snowball we saw to other academic skills. So ultimately showing that the preschool oral language skills are critical. Stepping back a little bit more, how does SES influence language and literacy skills? This is a figure from an Economic Policy Institute brief in 2002, and this is sort of a seminal policy brief called "Inequality at the Starting Gate," and it addresses the point of the policy brief was to investigate the veracity of Horace Mann's famous quote about whether education is truly the great equalizer in our society. And so they analyzed data from more than 21,000 children across the country to try and understand why public education was not this great equalizer. And there's so many great takeaways from this brief, but I want to highlight a couple. First was that SES was very strongly related to early literacy skills. They looked at many different factors in children's early life, things like family expectations, access to childcare, reading, computers, television, all sorts of things. And they found that socioeconomic status accounted for more of the variation in children's early literacy than any of these other factors. They also highlighted this sort of snowballing of inequities. So children from lower SES homes tended to begin kindergarten in lower quality elementary schools than their more advantaged peers, no matter how you defined school quality. And so the least advantaged children were then in consistently lower quality schools, and it exacerbated these disparities. And so the main takeaway here is that these inequalities can develop even before children reach school age and then ultimately get reinforced in school. A study that I think is really interesting and sort of motivates why one of the reasons I'm so interested in language is that when we look across all of the different cognitive capacities children have, SES has an effect on many of them, but it has the greatest effect on language. So our language skills are the cognitive skill seemingly most influenced by early socioeconomic status. And so in some studies finding that at kindergarten entry, that should say SES explains 30% of the variation in children's language skills. So disproportionate effect on language and literacy skills, more than double the effect size of the next most affected skills, which are aspects of executive functioning. And in some of my work, I've also looked into this relationship between language and executive functioning. So remember, I showed you a figure early on that showed how aspects of memory and attention are important for learning to read. And so I've done some really my animations are backwards. It's okay. I've done some work recently showing that these differences in executive functioning, or EF, can even themselves be driven by oral language skills. And so looking at children longitudinally from ages 3 to 5 throughout preschool into kindergarten entry, we find that socioeconomic differences in executive functioning can almost completely be explained by SES differences in language development. And so ultimately, this suggests that EF skills like attention, working memory, cognitive flexibility, we know these are important for learning how to decode and becoming a fluent reader. This suggests that oral language can also have what we call an indirect effect on literacy through EF development. So there can be a direct effect where if you struggle with core language skills, then it can also directly affect literacy, but then it can indirectly affect through executive functioning as well. So this is preschoolers, age 3, but what about even earlier, infants and toddlers? And so then I want to dig into these opportunity gaps. So this draws attention to the conditions and obstacles that young students face throughout their educational careers, and thinking about the opportunities in early life and how they support later learning. And so this is sort of an evolution of some studies. This is a graph from one of the very first studies from Janelle and Huttenlocker to show a relationship between the amount of speech that children heard and their language development. So at the time when this paper was published, this was actually revolutionary because the prevailing viewpoint in language and literacy at the time was that I guess in linguistics, maybe not in education, but in linguistics, people thought that language development was this innate skill, and that individual differences amongst people were largely irrelevant. And so they were some of the first people to show that actually there are individual differences in children's language development that vary in relation to the speech they hear. Several years later, some more foundational research found that the number of words directed to children at 19 months of age predicted their vocabulary size 5 months later. When they were 2-year-olds. And then some of my early work from a few years ago extended this beyond just the number of words and actually found that it's not just the amount of speech that children hear, but it's specifically interactive speech. So something we call conversational turns. So anytime an adult speaks and a child responds, or a child speaks and an adult responds, we call that a conversational turn. And that the amount of conversational turns children hear is deeply associated with their language development. And again, I'm thinking of language broadly in terms of vocabulary and structure. And we also have evidence of this from the brain. Here are a couple of studies with infants, very young infants, doing a type of brain imaging called EEG, where you put a net of electrodes on their heads, and you can look at their brain activation in real time. And so I've got images from 2 studies, but both with the same conclusion that infants who heard more language input showed more advanced neural patterns and of language development. So on the left, it's actually an interesting phenomenon where as infants become more attuned to the languages they hear, their native languages, they start to get bad at detecting aspects of other languages. And so you can actually track how on course children are with adapting to their own language by looking at these neural patterns. And so it suggests that there's environmental effects even within the first years of life. Um, and then more recently, we've been able to use a really cool aspect of technology to track children's language experience in real time. Um, so sort of this figure on the left is the way it used to be done, where families, we would do audio recordings or video recordings of short snippets of families' lives, and sort of keep track of the language experienced and then children's language development. Now we have an ability to pop little recorders on children and measure their language experience throughout the day. What I think is really interesting is that there's massive variability also within SES groups. So while we often talk about differences across SES groups in children's language experience, these are averages, and there's still a lot of variability within SES groups. And so this is a graph of families all from lower SES backgrounds, and you can see the variation in the number of words that children heard throughout the day, ranging from 2,000 words to nearly 30,000 words. And then this other graph is really sort of hammering home the same sort of concept that there's more variation within SES groups than there is across SES groups. And then that's a really important factor for trying to understand why there are individual differences in children's language development. And finally, I want to highlight some additional aspects of this opportunity, these opportunity differences. Trying to answer the question of why children's language environments differ. This is a really interesting study that came out a couple of years ago that found that what they did is they had families come in and parents would take they'd have to write a little essay on either on something completely innocuous, or they had to reflect on a time that money was tight, a time of financial scarcity. And then they would go play with their children. They would record the language and count the words and all of this stuff. And ultimately, they found that after families had reflected on financial scarcity, they spoke less to their 3-year-old children in the subsequent play session. And these were actually relatively advantaged families. So it really highlights the psychological impacts of financial scarcity on language environments. Another really sort of seminal study from a couple of years ago showed that if you actually reduce poverty levels by giving income support to low-income mothers, it actually changes the brain activity in the babies that is associated with language development. This is showing sort of this causal effect of when there are opportunity gaps or structural barriers to language experience. Finally, I wanted to sort of shift into this aspect of thinking about not just the amount of speech, but the kinds of speech. These are some findings from research studies that show that there's different aspects of speech that predict children's language development at different ages. And so when children are infants, the number of words heard is really important. They need to hear a lot of language, and that supports their vocabulary development. But as they get older, there's different aspects of the language environment that are important. So things like diverse vocabulary, hearing different kinds of words, hearing more rare words. And then finally, as they get into preschool age, hearing what we call decontextualized language. So instead of just talking about things in the here and now, talking about things that maybe are in the past or the future, talking about connections between different things. And so this research suggests that the types of language that children hear sort of varies across developmental levels. Um, and so sort of supporting that idea of qualitative aspects of language, this is some of my research, connecting these conversational turns, which is a fundamental interactive piece of language development or of language experience, to brain activation. So we used those little language recorders to record 2 full days of children's language environments, and ultimately found that the sheer number of words they heard didn't have a strong relationship to their brain activation during language processing, but the conversational turns, so this back and forth interactive language development or interactive language experience, was really what was promoting language development. And then some of my colleagues at Columbia replicated this study and extended it directly to reading skills, and found that the number of conversational turns children experience was directly related to physical growth in parts of the brain related to children's literacy skills. And the final sort of brain graph I'll show you was from an intervention study we did that looked at brain development over time as when supporting children's early language environments. And so over time, children who experienced more increases in conversational turns that they heard, they experienced physical growth, thickening of the brain cortex in core language regions, as well as in regions responsible for executive functioning. So showing that even, this is in kindergartners, so even in kindergartners, changing the early language environment can also change brain development. And then this is just a similar graph showing the same thing in the other receptive language region, but also a region involved in social cognition. So sort of supporting this idea that this interactive back and forth conversation is really supporting language, executive functioning, and social cognition. So oral language does more than just supporting a literacy. It supports a wide variety of skills. Finally, I want to touch on some practical implications. So what are some ways, I hope I've thoroughly convinced you of the importance of early language development for brain development and for literacy development. And so what are some ways that we can practically increase children's language experience and ultimately improve literacy development? And so I'll point quickly to this really wonderful developmental model from some of my colleagues at Harvard that emphasize these multiple dimensions of language exposure and how they interact and build on each other and evolve in conjunction with children's developmental stages. So as I talked about things like decontextualized language, that's an aspect of what we call conceptual. What are you physically talking about? There's an aspect of our linguistic communication. So that's our vocabulary, our syntax, our grammar, things we're using there. And then there's these aspects of interactive interaction. So are you, taking turns? Are you responding to children and extending what they talk about? And so the idea is that all three of these different dimensions of language exposure evolve in conjunction with children's developmental stage. And so their early language experience should as well. And so some practical studies that have shown aspects of how this influences children's language and literacy development. This is a wonderful study showing, here, I'll go ahead and put everything up, that preschool teachers' use of what they call sophisticated vocabulary during free play really influenced kindergarten children's language measures. Which ultimately influenced fourth grade reading comprehension. And they specifically highlight aspects of teacher interactions that encourage language learning are staying on a single topic for an extended period of time, but also providing children opportunities to talk, encouraging analytical thinking, so some of these conceptual aspects, and then giving information about the meanings of words. And so these are teacher interactions that encourage language learning, especially in preschool ages. Another really well-researched and influential technique is called dialogic reading. And this is a structured form of shared book reading. I'm not going to read everything on this slide, but ultimately the idea is that the book reading becomes a conversation. And so you're not just reading the text on the page from, teacher to child or parent to child, but it becomes a conversation. The child becomes the storyteller, the adult becomes the listener, the questioner, and the audience, and you go back and forth. And so it promotes additional language. It promotes active child engagement in reading and exposes them to increased amounts of language and different kinds of language as well. And then the last couple of things I'll highlight are some ways to build language into everyday experiences. This is an effort called Playful Learning Landscapes, which tries to embed prompts for increasing language into the natural world, into the community and public settings. So, for example, building language learning opportunities into bus stops and into libraries, into grocery stores. Encouraging parents and caregivers to talk about the colors, the shapes, the things that you can talk about in the grocery store. So connecting these everyday shared spaces with people who occupy them. A very similar program out west is called Everyday Language Learning Opportunities, or ELLO, doing similar things, trying to boost language learning in its natural environment. And then I'll just briefly highlight a project I'm working on that is trying to implement this also into libraries. It's called a Hatchlings project. Funded through the Institute of Museum and Library Services, trying to empower parents as their baby's first and most important teacher, and really instill the idea that we start building literacy from birth through language, and that families can support literacy in children's earliest months of life. And so stay tuned for more research from that. I'm happy to share the slides, so I have a couple of suggestions for further reading on these topics if you're interested, and I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. What fascinating information, and it just makes you want to get out there and start reading books to little guys.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for that. One question that we have is, how does this work apply to students who are multilingual learners? And yeah, can you speak to that population of students?
It's such a great question. So a lot of the research I highlighted today was primarily with native English speakers. However, the findings applies across the board to children learning any language, including multiple languages. So I always say as when I put my SLP hat on and talk with families, especially families who English is not their native language, they say, "Oh, but I should speak lots of English to my child so they learn lots of English." And I say, yes, that's important, but also children need a first language to build a second language, and so it's really important for children to hear native languages as well. And so this is all of this work is immensely applicable to multilingual learners as well. The importance of an early language foundation supports literacy no matter the language. And in fact, it can introduce some interesting opportunities for comparing and contrasting, which can further instill some of those literacy capacities.
It makes me think about the slide that you put up relatively early in the discussion about how some of the structural components of language are really important younger. So,
Mm-hmm.
does it speak to that piece, the form of language? So, syntax and morphology, phonology, that those are the aspects that need to be very well established in that native language.
Absolutely. Yeah, those are the things that it gets much harder to learn as you get older. It doesn't mean you can't learn them, but it gets harder to learn. Our brains are really primed to learn those structural aspects of language in infancy and early childhood. And so being able to learn how words build to sentences, how sounds build to words, that's what's really critical in those early years. And even though languages vary in how those sounds go together, how those words go together, the principles of combining them to make meaning are universal. And so getting children used to that analytical capacity to say, okay, this is the input I'm receiving. Children are doing statistics all the time, and figuring out, okay, this is what that means, this is what that means, and this is how I create meaning myself. And so hearing that in any language is critical, and especially from a language that the caregiver feels most comfortable in. That is ultimately what's really important.
Oh, that's incredible. That's great. That's great information. Thank you so much. One thing that you did mention is this sensitive age for optimal learning. And so, what ways do we accelerate learning for those who have missed that, for students who may have missed that window?
It's such a good question. I know. I worry too much about saying, by saying the importance of the early years, I don't want to give the impression that the later years aren't also important. And this is especially important. I think about children who may have missed opportunities in early life, to build those building blocks later on. So we know from research with, especially research with deaf children who maybe have not been exposed to language from early in life, but get it later on, that you can, even though the brain it makes it harder to learn languages later on, you still can, and you can still build a lot of those foundational skills later. So I don't want to give the impression that, it's doomed for children who maybe don't get those strong foundations early
Right.
in life, but it is, the more we can build the strong early foundations, the easier it is later on.
Great. I think we have another question from from one of the audience members. Okay, so here we have, how do you explain the importance of continuously developing oral language, specifically in the context of the science of reading models?
Ooh, this is such a good question. This is where I'd say that it all builds on each other. When in these science of reading models, focusing on the importance of these structural aspects of phonological awareness and the code parts of the skills, we know how critical these are. And ultimately, I like to think that when you unlock the code, you're unlocking access to more language as well. And so, even though I've described it as oral language, which it is, right? Early in life, it's the language you hear, and so it is presented orally. Ultimately, it's under the umbrella of language. Once you unlock the ability to decode and read, you have access to much more complex language. And so, even though it may not be technically oral, it is still. It's still access to the vocabulary and syntax of whatever language you're speaking or reading, and they build on each other. Really, I think having those conversations, enforcing the dialogic aspect of reading, I think that's really critical for building these snowballs of oral language, or I mean language, and literacy together.
That's great. That's great. Sometimes we hear in the field, we hear the saying or the sentiment that one's oral language sets the bar for oral comprehension, sets the bar for reading comprehension, and so
Hmm.
we always have to be raising the bar in what we understand through our ears um, in order to have that understanding with the information that comes into our eyes. So.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's
Exactly.
really
They build on
wonderful.
each other.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you so, so much for joining us today. We love that you shared your insights about literacy development, and there's a lot of work that you have done, and that continues to, we still have the need to experience more in the field. So we appreciate your dedication and your contributions. We also want to thank everybody here who has joined our session today. It was in fact recorded, and so this will be sent to those who have registered for the link tomorrow, so be on the lookout for that. And if you would like to learn more about Hill for Literacy, you can visit our website at hillforliteracy.org. You can also follow us on LinkedIn or other social media platforms. We also want to mention that we are releasing our latest course in something called the implementation of HQIM, which stands for High Quality Instructional Materials. And this course is designed to be your companion to unpacking a core program and maybe some supplemental materials, but whatever you are using for your literacy curriculum. And so we have some open enrollment for that, and for some summer courses in the science of reading. We have an early educator version. We have primary and secondary. We also have an adolescent literacy course for middle and high school teachers. So be on the lookout for that. And we are so happy to have you join us today. This summer, we'll be taking a break from these types of webinar series, but definitely stay tuned for more panel discussions when the school year begins in the fall. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Bye, everyone.